Now I want to paint you a little bit of a picture of how societies evolve, because that's the title of this episode. So here's how it works. Basically, human societies go from hunting and gathering to horticultural, which is raising of small animals in non-mass scales, then agrarian, which is basically massive farming, then from agrarian to industrial, and then from industrial to post-industrial, which is sort of a knowledge worker economy and a service economy, which is a lot of Northern Europe and America, Canada, and so forth. So we have the pre-industrial era, we have the industrial era, and we got the post-industrial era. And really, some of the key distinctions here is a citizen college educated or not? Are citizens interested in philosophy and science or not? Are they knowledge workers or are they manual laborers? These sorts of distinctions are very important for determining sort of the political trajectory of a country. Most people are not educated enough for anything but manual labor, at least right now in the world. That's the case. As more people come together, but they are not very well educated, they need to be organized by some sort of higher intelligent force. And oftentimes this needs to be through brute force because they don't understand anything else. So this leads to totalitarian regimes and autocracies and dictatorships and tyrannies, right? You have thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are not intelligent enough to do anything but manual work. So what do? You corral them together into one group so they can defend themselves against invaders, right? And for that, you need some sort of tyrant or dictator. Then what happens is that as you're organizing these people, your population becomes so large that it requires more and more bureaucracy. Because, if you're only organizing 1,000 people, you can do that through word of mouth. If you're trying to organize 1 million people, now you need records, you need writing systems, you need language, you need accountants, you need bureaucrats to manage that for you. But these bureaucrats and these accountants and so forth, what do they need to be? They can't be dumb manual laborers. They need to be knowledge workers. They need to be intelligent. They need to go through years of education to learn language, to learn how to think, to learn some philosophy, and so forth. So as the population grows, education becomes imperative. And so we build bureaucracies that provide education, school systems. And then as more people become educated, those who rise to the top are not the manual laborers, but the elites who are the most educated, because actually the education and the intelligence it takes to organize manual labor is far more valuable in the grand scheme of things than manual labor itself. And then as we do this, as we create better organizations for our society, this leads to better and better economic efficiency, more trading, more opportunities for technology. As we develop more technology, of course, technology leads to better education and puts more demand on education because you need to be more educated to learn to use the technology effectively, right? You got to be pretty well educated to learn to use a computer and so forth. Some illiterate person can't just use a computer. So everything here turns into this sort of upward spiral where economic success leads to more education and more technology, and then yet more technology and more education leads to more economic success, and this creates this upward spiral until we get out of the rut of having to be worried about basic survival needs like food, water, shelter, and so forth. This becomes relatively easy to acquire after a certain point. And at this point, we've built up so much social infrastructure in order to manage all of this that now we are also much more socially interconnected with each other. And this allows for more self-expression to flourish. This puts pressure on people because they're more knowledgeable and educated to push for democracy. Now people are not just satisfied with putting food in their belly and clothing and sheltering their children. Now people want more. They want to have a say. They want to run for office. They want more civil rights. They want more gay rights. They want more sexual rights. They want more technological rights. They want free speech. They want all this sort of stuff. And survival, brute survival, starts to be taken for granted. And now survival moves into the more abstract, creative domain, the self-expressive domain. Values shift from the traditional survival values to now the secular, rational, self-expressive values. And now people demand democracy, where before an autocrat or a tyrant or a king could manage this whole affair. Now people see the injustice of that, and they demand democracy. And so really, democracy is the fruit of dictatorship and monarchy. So if a king or a dictator becomes very, very successful at organizing people, eventually those people will overthrow the king or the dictator. So the king or dictator ends up undoing his own self, which is why basically all kings and dictators have a very short lifetime. They don't tend to live very long, precisely because when they succeed, they become irrelevant. And when they fail, well, of course, they also become irrelevant because they get replaced by somebody more vicious than them. Also, what happens is that as we have more knowledge workers and more education in a society, workers in general, rather than just being dumb manual laborers, now they have a more understanding, more sophistication. They think cognitively in more sophisticated ways. And now they are able to organize better with each other. Because you see, to be an effective knowledge worker means that you need to have more education. And the more education you have, the more free you're able to use your mind to look at the world and to see injustices in the world and to demand freedom for self-expression. And so higher education increases the need and demand for democracy. And as this happens, organized religions decline because with higher education, now we're more empirical and we start to question our own dogmas and ideologies. So we go back, we examine our old traditions, and we realize that many of our old traditions and religions and dogmas, they were not absolute truths. They were just vehicles to get us to where we are today. They were certain survival patterns and habits. And that now that our environment has changed, it's time to outgrow those. And so we outgrow those, and oftentimes we go more secular and rational. As this happens also, xenophobia, racism, sexism, homophobia, and elitism, all of these decline because all of them basically were coming from fear and insecurity. Once we become more secure in ourselves, we don't need to fight everybody for food and shelter and so on. And once we start to transcend and question our old traditions from religion, now we don't need to be so xenophobic. We can be friends with our neighbors, even though they're a different race or a different nationality. Now we can be more tolerant of different genders. We can see the equality. We can be even tolerant of homosexuality and so on. We're moving away from fear and towards greater consciousness and self-acceptance. Now, of course, as this secularism prevails over the population, fundamentalist movements break out as collective ego backlashes to try to go back. And this breaks out amongst people, those parts of society which are not as educated and are not being advanced as quickly to the cutting edge of where society is going. So basically, that part of society which you tend to leave behind and which you don't educate, that part of society which doesn't experience the economic prosperity that the other half of society does, they tend to get resentful and fearful, and perhaps rightly so, and they start these fundamentalist and nationalist movements. But these are temporary because remember, the society still keeps getting more evolved, more wealthy, more prosperous, so eventually it will at some point all trickle down even to the fundamentalists, and it will make them more pacified and more secure, and eventually they'll be ready after a certain point to let go of their fundamentalism. Or if they're not, then their generation will simply die out, and the next generation will start from a cleaner slate and be less infected with those dogmas and ideologies. So the success of previous generation creates the foundation for the next generation, which is free to be more liberal and more self-expressive. So this is how society works. And every generation basically becomes progressively a little bit more liberal than the previous one.